Hey Rishi, so awesome question. Thanks very much for that. I think, yeah, there could be a few things that you're asking here, but I'll try and touch on it from the most broad level, um, in terms of Mendelian inheritance, and particularly about dominant recessive inheritance. So we won't look at X-linked right now, but if that's something you want me to cover, I'm happy to do a video on that as well. Uh, so yeah, dominant recessive, not sex-linked, and then from that, also, you've got homozygous and heterozygous. And so, at the top, kind of bird's eye view of it all, for any trait, let's just say this trait, a really common one is something like eye color, right? Let's say that you, for the simplicity of this explanation, that you can only either have green eyes or, what's another eye color? Maybe brown eyes. If I can get brown. Yeah, cool. So you can only have green or brown in this example, and the eye color might not be the best trait, but it's one that works here. Okay, so we know that whether or not you have green or brown eyes is determined by the genes passed by parents. And specifically here, when we say genes, what we really mean for this Mendelian model is something called an allele. And an allele is kind of a variant of a specific trait. And these variants can either be dominant or recessive. So when you talk about an allele, an actual allele in of itself, or the entire trait that allele controls, that's what's dominant or recessive. When we talk about, okay, the actual parent with that trait already, they can either be then homozygous or heterozygous. Let me give you an example. Let's say that so remember, for the allele, there's got to be a dominant and a recessive trait. Let's say the dominant trait is green eyes. So we're going to represent that with a capital G. Oops. Okay. And then we're going to represent our brown eyes, which is the recessive trait. Sorry, I don't know why that all, but that's okay. As lowercase g. And it might seem weird, like, why would we do it as, I'm just going to actually change this because that's confusing. So that's dominant. This is recessive. It might be a bit confusing. Why do we still use G? Well, the recessive allele and the notation around that depends on the dominant allele. In a nutshell, why does dominance and recessive matter? Well, if you've got two dominant alleles, right? So say this is, we'll assign these like, this is, in this case, parent one, right? So if parent one has two of these dominant green eye alleles, it might follow that, yeah, they're going to have green eyes, right? If parent two, though, has two little g alleles, so they've got both alleles for the recessive trait, which is brown eyes. well, they're going to have brown eyes. So that's not really the confusing part. If you've got both sets, you're just going to have the type of trait that that allele codes for. Where it gets confusing is, okay, what if I've got one big G and one little g? Well, that's where we go back to, okay, what is actually the dominant trait? Because in this scenario, the dominant trait will prevail. So we would have a green eyes situation there. And the example that we used here, this is heterozygous. So when we have one of each, that's heterozygous. When we have a pair of the same type of allele, these are both homozygous. So where dominant and recessive traits come in is they distinguish, okay, what variant of that trait does a heterozygous individual express? All right. So now we kind of take that knowledge and we apply it to a type of question, right? What you might deal with is something called a Punnett square. And in a Punnett square, if we have, so everyone will have, in this simplified model, right, for a trait, they're going to have two alleles. One from mum, one from dad. And they're not going to have more than that. You can have multiple traits being coded for, but in this example, it's just one allele set that codes for the trait, and then you're just going to get one from each of the parents. So if we've got one parent that has one dominant allele and one recessive allele, so a heterozygous parent, and then we've got another parent who has brown eyes, so they've got both little g recessive alleles. When we draw up a Punnett square, we can figure out, okay, what are the possible combinations that they could pass down to their offspring? And we essentially just cross them here. So we can match, there's a possibility that there's big G, little g. You could get big G, little g again here. You could get little g here, or you could get double G there as well. And so you're trying to figure out, okay, if the question is, okay, what are the chances that child has brown eyes, let's say? Well, out of our sample set, only little g are ever going to have brown eyes. So that's going to be this one and this one. These two, because they're the heterozygous version and our green-eyed trait is dominant, these two are going to have green eyes. So the percentage of offspring that will have brown eyes is 50%. Okay, so that's a really quick overview about how you might tackle with just kind of the foundation concepts of dominant and recessive alleles and individuals being homozygous or heterozygous for a particular trait, and how someone can express a trait but still carry the recessive allele and pass it on to their children. And so how that would work is if you see like, both of my parents have blue eyes, right? But you have brown eyes. Well, that might be how. That each one of your parents was heterozygous and they both pass down this little g to you. So then you have the homozygous recessive trait and you'll express the other version. So I hope that helps, but I'm assuming you've probably got more in-depth like evolutions on this topic later down the line, Rishi. So feel free to submit any more questions you've got. I wasn't sure exactly on the context of where you're at in terms of your unit at the moment. So I just wanted to give you a very baseline understanding about, okay, what separates homozygous, heterozygous, what separates dominant, recessive. Yeah, the key for differentiating, if you don't have the background information, and say you're just given a Punnett square or some information about the actual phenotypic expression. Also, by the way, the allele pairing, so what they actually have on the genetic level is called the genotypic expression. But what they actually express, whether it's brown or green, or blue eyes, that's the phenotypic expression. And so you can have the phenotype for brown eyes. You'll have to have the genotype GG, little g. But if you've got the phenotype for green eyes, we don't actually know what your genotype would have had to have been, unless we have further information. But yeah, working backwards as well, you can kind of figure out, okay, which trait must have been dominant and which must have been recessive by looking at these like heterozygous individuals and seeing, okay, if they've got the dominant trait and the recessive trait, which one of those was expressed? From there, you can figure out, okay, I know that such and such is dominant, and therefore I can figure out all of the allele pairings. Yeah, so I hope that helps a little bit, Rishi, but happy to answer anything else in the future and explain you through this, because yeah, it's something like, even though I didn't really do biology in school, it's something I've covered throughout my med degree. So I can help you out with it for sure. And yeah, I hope it helps. If you enjoy what we're doing, really appreciate if you could support the channel a little bit. That means a lot to us. And yeah, thanks very much, Rishi. Have a good one.